The heat was a physical weight pushing down on the valley of Red Ridge, where the dust settled like a shroud over the broken spirits of the homesteaders who had tried to tame a land that only knew how to take and never how to give back. Elena stood on the porch of her father's rotting cabin, her hands tied with a length of rough hemp rope that bit into her wrists with every shallow breath she took, while the sun beat down on her head with the merciless persistence of a debt collector who never forgets a single cent. Her father, Silas, was sitting in the dirt nearby, his head buried in his hands and his shoulders slumped under the crushing weight of a gambling debt that had spiraled out of control until it consumed the only thing he had left of value, which was his own flesh and blood. The man who had bought her was a land baron named Aldridge, a man with a heart made of cold iron and eyes that saw people as nothing more than figures in a ledger to be added or subtracted to suit his expansionist greed. Aldridge was standing by his black carriage, his suit too clean for the frontier, and his smile as sharp as a razor blade, as he waited for the final signatures to be placed on the paperwork that would turn a young woman into a piece of property in exchange for the title to a dying ranch. It was a transaction of desperation masked by the thin veneer of territorial law. And you know what really gets me? Every time I tell this story is not the cruelty of the deal, but the absolute silence of the neighbors who stood on the boardwalks watching a life being signed away as if it were just another Tuesday morning errand. I can never get past that detail because it shows how a system can be used to make the most horrific crimes look like simple business necessities, and it haunts me to think about how many voices were silenced by the scratch of a pen in those dark days of the High Plains. Hey, real quick before we continue. If you have been following this series and you find yourself drawn to these tales of honor and blood, make sure to drop a like on this video and subscribe so you do not miss the next trail we travel together. And tell me in the comments where you are watching from today, because I read every single one of them, and it means a lot to see this community of riders grow now, back to that porch in Red Ridge where the air was about to turn cold, even in the heat of the noon sun, because a shadow was moving across the ridge, and it was not a cloud. Gunslinger rode down the slope at a walk, the rhythmic chime of his spurs sounding like a funeral bell for the plans that Aldridge had spent months perfecting. He pulled Scout up 10 yards from the carriage, his hazel eyes showing nothing but the weariness of a man who had seen too many men like Silas sell their souls for a moment of peace. Aldridge straightened up his hand, going toward the pearl hilt of a revolver that had likely never seen the heat of a real fight, and he told the stranger that this was private business and that the law of Red Ridge belonged to the man with the gold. The gunslinger did not reach for his Colts. Instead, he leaned forward and asked Aldridge if he knew what happens to a debt when the man holding the paper is no longer around to collect the interest. The silence that followed was so heavy it felt like the weight of the mountains pressing down on the yard, and Elena looked up through her tangled hair, seeing the worn poncho and the hazel-green eyes of a man who had stopped asking why and was now only focused on how the gunslinger dismounted his movements, fluid and quiet like a mountain lion moving through the tall grass, and he walked toward the porch, ignoring the hired guns who were fanning out to create the angles they thought would trap him. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a stack of receipts and telegrams that he had taken from the land office in Mile Haven. Earlier that morning, papers that proved the debt Silas owed was a fabrication created by a corrupt judge and a railroad agent who wanted the valley cleared for the coming tracks. The gunslinger was not there to save a girl. He was there to collect a different kind of debt, which was the truth that the systems of the territory had tried to bury in the dust of the frontier. He dropped the papers at Aldridge's feet and told him that the only signature that mattered today was the one he was going to place on a full confession before the smoke cleared. From the yard, Aldridge laughed a dry sound, like dead leaves skittering across a boardwalk, and he gave the signal for his men to fire. But they had underestimated the speed of a man who had been trained by the wind and the silence. The man on the far left, went down before his hand could find the trigger of his carbine. The gunslinger moved with the economy of a hawk striking in the grass. 2-3, the two guards near the carriage were hit as they tried to find cover behind the wheels, while the gunslinger shifted his aim with a precision that made the world seem to slow down into a series of mathematical equations. Where lead was the only answer, Elena did not run. She watched as the man who had bought her was reduced to a shaking coward in a silk suit, and she realized that the iron in the gunslinger's hand was the only honest law she had ever seen. The collection of the debt was not a quick affair, but a methodical dismantling of an empire of lies that had been built over 14 months of fraudulent foreclosures and broken promises. The gunslinger forced Aldridge to walk into the land office in town and reveal the secret ledgers that showed the names of every family who had been cheated out of their soil. He made the invisible visible in the way that things become clear when someone who has no stake in the deception looks directly at them, until the truth is the only thing left standing. By the time the sun began to dip behind the mesas, the town of Red Ridge was awake, and the people were holding the deeds to their own lives again, while the carriage that was supposed to carry Elena away was now being used to transport Aldridge to the territorial prison under the guard of a deputy who had finally found the courage to do his job. The gunslinger did not ask for thanks, and he did not ask for a name. He simply walked back to the livery stable and checked the cinches on Scout's saddle, preparing for the next mile of a trail that never seemed to end. I think about Elena sometimes, and whether she ever realized that the gunslinger did not just collect her father debt, he collected the soul of the entire valley and gave it back to the people who worked it. This whole journey of 8 episodes has been about the way a single person with enough resolve can break a system that thinks it is untouchable, and the story of Red Ridge is the clearest evidence of that power. The livery stable was a place of dim light and the heavy scent of oats and old leather, where the shadows stretched long across the dirt floor, and the sound of a lone fiddle could be heard from the saloon across the street. The town of Red Ridge was the kind of place that had grown faster than its own wisdom, attracting money and greed in equal measure until the air was thick with the rot of ambition. The gunslinger moved through this world like a ghost in a poncho, appearing when the smoke was rising and vanishing before the embers could turn to ash. Silas looked at his daughter with eyes that were clouded by shame and the haze of a lifetime of bad decisions, and he realized that the man standing in front of him was not a savior, but a mirror showing him exactly what he had become. The gunslinger told him that a father who sells his daughter has no place on the frontier, and that the road south was the only thing Silas had left to claim. You know what really gets me? Every time I look back at the history of these high plains, is how often the people we call outlaws were the only ones holding on to any sense of honor, while the men in suits were busy selling the world out from under the feet of their own neighbors. It is a detail that I keep returning to in my research, because it shows that the labels we give people often hide the truth of who they really are when the lights go out and the lead starts to fly. Alina watched the stranger ride out into the fading light of the desert, and she felt the weight of the hemp rope finally leaving her wrists, replaced by a weight that was much heavier, which was the responsibility of being free in a land that does not forgive mistakes. She looked at her father and then at the ruined cabin, and she knew that the only way to move forward was to burn the past until only the truth was left in the ashes. The gunslinger had collected the debt in full, and he had paid it in a currency that Aldridge and Silas did not understand, which was the currency of justice and consequence. As Scout moved into the easy trot that covered miles without announcing them, the gunslinger thought about the next valley and the next secret that needed to be uncovered, because out here the truth is always buried under a layer of dust and blood, waiting for someone with enough iron to dig it out. The moon rose over the red rock formations, casting long, jagged shadows across the sand, and the gunslinger checked the cylinders of his Colts, hearing the satisfying click that meant he was ready for whatever the night decided to throw at him. He was a man who belonged to no one, and yet he was the only one who truly understood the price of belonging to a place he rode, until the stars were the only light left in the world, and he slept with his head on his saddle and his hand on his iron, dreaming of a frontier where no man could be bought and no woman could be sold for the price of a debt. The story of Elena and Red Ridge would be told in the saloons for years to come, but the name of the man who saved them would remain a mystery, hidden in the whispers of the wind and the smoke of the campfires. And that was exactly how he wanted it, because a legend is only useful as long as it does not have a face to be targeted by the law. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this road, and I hope you found something in this tale that makes the modern world feel a little less heavy and a little more honest. God bless the riders and the ones who keep the receipts, and I will see you on the next trail where the guns are always loaded. And the truth is the only thing that survives the fire. The high country in the autumn has a quality that the border grass country does not, a color in the cedar and the oak, that the constant green of the south does not produce a light that comes at an angle through the trees that makes the country look lit from inside rather than from above. He rode through it and thought about fire, about what it meant as a tool. Not the accidental fire, but the deliberate fire that is set not to destroy, but to communicate, to tell the person who comes back and finds the smoke that the situation has been decided, and the decision was not theirs to make. It was a language as old as the mountains, and the railroad had not invented it. Men with more resources than the people in their way had been using it since before there were railroads, but the paperwork made it invisible. The gunslinger had made it personal, and by doing so, he had made it real. He had connected the foreclosure filing dates to the railroad announcement dates, and he had exposed the deadly truth that was hidden in plain sight. Scout moved without being asked the easy trot that covered miles without announcing them, and he rode toward the south where the shadows were long and the secrets were deep. He reached a small settlement called Blackwater by sunset, and he walked into the general store with his head low and his hat pulled down over his eyes, buying only what he needed for the trail ahead: dried beef and beans and a new box of 50 caliber shells for the Colts that had seen him through the ruin. The storekeeper looked at him with curiosity, noting the worn poncho and the hazel eyes that seemed to see right through the walls of the building. But he did not ask any questions because he was a man of the frontier, and he knew that some men carried enough history on their shoulders to crush a weaker spirit. The gunslinger paid with a silver dollar, and he felt a strange sense of closure as the coin touched the wooden counter. He camped that night in the lee of a massive red rock formation that looked like a cathedral carved by the wind, and he built a small fire of mesquite wood, watching the embers drift up toward the Milky Way, like the souls of all the men he had left behind in the valley. He was not a man who believed in heaven or hell, but he believed in the balance of things, and he knew that the scales had been leveled in Red Ridge, even if the cost had been the destruction of a legacy and the displacement of a man who had never asked for any of it. He woke up before the dawn and saddled Scout in the gray light of the morning, feeling a renewed sense of purpose as he looked toward the west, where the trail disappeared into the horizon line of the Sonoran Desert, where new betrayals and new legends were surely waiting for a man of his particular skills. He rode on into the silence of the dawn, leaving the echoes of the cabin and the land office far behind him, in the dust of history, and he did not stop until the sun was high and the heat was a shimmering wall in front of him, and he was just another rider on the long road to nowhere. This story is finished, but the spirit of the gunslinger remains a part of the landscape, and if you listen closely to the wind in the cedars, you might still hear the click of a hammer and the rustle of a poncho as the man with no name moves on to the next ridge, where the shadows are long and the stories are deep, and the truth is the only thing that remains after the smoke has cleared away into the blue sky. The desert wind is a lonely thing when it has no one left to talk to, and the canyons are a deep grave for the secrets that men try to keep. But the gunslinger knew that the wind always carries the truth to those who know how to listen, and he knew that out here on the edge of the map, the only reason to stay is the one you build with your own two hands. They would rebuild the ranch, and they would defend the valley, and the railroad would eventually come, but it would come on the terms of the people who worked the land rather than the people who owned the paper. And that was the greatest victory of all. The sun rose, again painting the world in colors of gold and orange, and the gunslinger felt the weight of his past lift from his shoulders like the evening mist. Sarah was safe at the ranch talking to her father in the shadows of the porch, and the old man was holding the receipts like they were holy relics. He saddled Scout and prepared to move on because he was a man of the road, and there were other fires to put out and other truths to reveal. But he knew that he would come back to this corridor because it was the only place where the silence did not feel like a threat. Thank you for being a part of this journey and for helping to keep the legends of the frontier alive. Every like and every comment is a step on the trail. We travel together, and I look forward to seeing you when the dust settles on the next road we find. God bless the high country, and God bless the ones who have the courage to choose the path of honor, because that is where the real stories are born, and where the real power is found in the teeth of the wind and the rhythm of the horse. Goodbye for now, and adios to the ghosts of the high plains. We will meet again in the next valley where the guns are always loaded, and the truth is the only thing that remains after the smoke has cleared away into the infinite blue of the western sky. A rode until the stars were the only light left in the world, and the silence was so deep it felt like a physical presence against his chest, and he was content to be a ghost in a land that was still finding its own name. Scout was steady, and the iron was cold, and the future was a road that did not have a map yet, and he was ready for whatever was waiting around the bend of the canyon. The scent of sage and ancient stone rose to meet him, and he smiled because some debts are never truly collected until the last man standing decides to stop counting the years and starts counting the bullets. He had seen enough to know that the desert never forgets a crime, but it also never forgets a man who shows up with a fast draw and an honest heart. The story of Elena and Silas was just one more chapter in a book of blood and light, and as he crossed the next ridge, he felt the familiar pull of the unknown calling him forward into the dark. Thank you and adios until the next time our paths cross in the dust of the Old West. The high plains are wide and the memory of the gunslinger is long, but the story is only as good as the ones who stay to listen to it. To the end, and for that I am grateful. Keep your eyes on the horizon and your heart in the right place. Because out here, the truth is the only thing that matters when the sun goes down and the shadows start to walk among the rocks. Goodbye and safe travels to everyone who follows the trail beyond the edge of the map, where the ghosts still ride and the legends never die. Adios. The desert sand shifted beneath Scout-S hooves as they moved into the gathering gloom of the lowlands, and the gunslinger felt the presence of the night as a shield rather than a threat. He thought about the doll that May had held, and he hoped that she was finding a reason to smile again in a house that was no longer haunted by the ghost of a debt that was never hers to pay. He knew that Silas would have to spend the rest of his life earning back the respect he had sold for a moment of gambling luck. But that was a road Silas would have to walk alone, because the frontier only gives you one chance to be a father before it turns you into a warning. He checked the horizon for any sign of following riders, but the valley was still, and the only thing moving was the wind in the mesquite brush. He felt a sense of completion, as if a circle had been closed, and he knew that the receipts he had delivered to Garrett would be the only law that matters. In the coming months, the railroad would have to pay for what they wanted, and the families would have to stand together to make sure they did not get cheated again. It was a hard lesson to learn, but the best lessons are always the ones that leave a scar. He rode until the moon was high enough to light the trail like a silver ribbon through the sage, and he did not stop until he found a place where the water was sweet and the grass was thick enough for Scout to rest. He was a man of few words and even fewer friends, but he was a man who knew the value of a promise, and that was enough to keep him moving through the dark. The story of Red Ridge was over, but the story of the gunslinger without a name was just beginning. Its next movement, and I hope you are ready for the miles that lay ahead, because the trail only gets deeper from here. Thank you for your time and your support, and may your own trail always lead you to a place of truth and honor. God bless the West, and God bless the gunslinger, who knows that the best way to collect a debt is to make sure it never happens again. Good night and stay safe on your own journey through the wilderness of life. And I will see you when the sun rises over the next valley of the Old West. Adios. The silence of the high desert was a living thing that breathed with the rhythm of the crickets and the distant howl of the coyote. And the gunslinger sat by his fire watching the sparks fly into the blackness of the sky, thinking about the way the gold can make a man blind to the beauty of his own blood. He knew that Silas was not a bad man, just a weak one. And out here, weakness is a luxury that no homesteader can afford for long. He thought about Aldridge and the clean suit and the cold eyes, and he realized that the frontier would always have men like him, waiting to turn a tragedy into a profit, and he knew that he would always have to be there to turn the profit back into a tragedy. For the men who sought to steal the sun, he checked the edge of his knife and the weight of his Colts, and he felt the familiar readiness that had kept him alive since the day he first crossed the border. He was a rider of the border and a hunter of the dark, and he would never be anything else until the last trail was finished and the last debt was settled in the dust. He thought about Elena's eyes and the way they had seen the truth in him, and he smiled because some connections are deeper than blood, and some bonds are stronger than any promise ever made by a man of paper. Adios, and may your own horse always find the way home. Through the dust and the shadows of the desert night, he rode until the stars were the only light left in the world. And the silence of the high Sierra was so deep, it felt like a physical presence pressing against his chest, and he knew that out there in the blackness, the ghosts of the cheated were finally at peace, because they had a witness who was not afraid to speak their names in the language of the gun. The story of Silas and Eldridge was over, but the story of the man with no name was just beginning another chapter, and I look forward to sharing it with you on the next road into the heart of the Wild West. Be safe and be free, and never forget that the truth is the only thing that survives the fire. God bless the frontier and everyone who has the heart to call it home. Adios. The moon was a silver scythe in the sky as the gunslinger finally closed his eyes under the protection of a high overhang, and the rhythm of Scout A's breathing was the only prayer he needed as he drifted into the heavy sleep of the just. He had collected the debt, and he had paid the price, and for one more night the world was balanced on the edge of a fast draw and a cold heart. Adios. Until we meet again on the next trail of the high country. The trail was long and the shadows were deep, but the gunslinger knew that as long as he had his horse and his steel, he could face whatever the night decided to throw at him. And he did not look back because the future was a road that had no name, and he was ready for whatever was waiting around the bend of the canyon. The scent of sage and ancient stone rose to meet him, and he smiled because some debts are never truly collected until the last man standing decides to stop counting the years and starts counting the bullets. He had seen enough to know that the desert never forgets a crime, but it also never forgets a man who shows up with a fast draw and an honest heart. The story of Elena and Silas was just one more chapter in a book of blood and light, and as he crossed the next ridge, he felt the familiar pull of the unknown calling him forward into the dark. Adios for now. And I will see you on the next trail where the guns are always loaded and the truth is the only thing that survives the test of time and the trials of the road. Be safe and be free. And never forget the lesson of the man who knew that the only way to lead a storm is to become a part of it yourself. Good night and adios to the legends of the high country and the ghosts of the old West who still ride the wind, looking for a place to call home after the smoke has cleared away into the infinite blue of the western sky. He rode until the sun began to peek over the eastern edge of the world, and the fire behind him was nothing more than a smudge of black on the horizon. But the scent of the smoke stayed with him, clinging to his poncho like a memory of a life he had left behind in the ruins of the territory. He thought about the geometry of the betrayal, and how Silas had almost succeeded in making him a footnote in a rancher's ledger. And he felt a grim satisfaction in knowing that the railroad would have to find another way to cross the valley, because the land office was now a pile of cinders, and the titles were as clear as the morning air. He stopped at a spring to water scout, and he looked at his reflection in the still pool, seeing the face of a man who had seen too much and done too much, but who could still look at the sky without flinching. The debt was settled and the marriage was over. But the gunslinger knew that he would always be a man who showed up when the smoke was rising, because that was the only trade he had ever known, and the only trade that ever mattered in a land that was still trying to decide what kind of people it wanted to keep. He rode on into the vastness of the territory, where the buffalo grass was tall and the sky was an azure, endless blue, and he did not look back because the past was a house on fire and the future was a road that did not have a name. Yet this concludes the chronicle of the daughter who was sold and the gunslinger who collected the debt in full. But the journey is far from over, and there are many more secrets buried in the sand of the Southwest, waiting for the right moment to be unearthed by the heat of a fast gun and a cold heart. Stay tuned for the next installment, where we follow the rostro of the Silver Dollar and the Ghost of the High Sierra, because the stories of the frontier are as infinite as the stars above the desert and as sharp as the spurs on a rider's boots. I will see you in the next valley where the guns are always loaded, and the truth is, the only thing that remains after the smoke has cleared away. Goodbye for now, and may your own trail be honest and your gun be fast. Adios. The desert stretched out before him as he left the valley, a sea of sagebrush and silence that held no memory of the railroad or the corrupted judge. And as the heat began to rise, the gunslinger felt the last of the resentment drain out of him, replaced by the cold focus of a hunter who knows that his future is finally in his own hands. He thought about the deeds Elena was holding, and he hoped that she was finding the strength to rebuild the ranch. And he hoped that Thomas was learning that the law is only as honest as the men who enforce it out here. The stars are the only ledger that never changes, and the only truth that never fades. He checked the cylinders of his Colts and felt the weight of the iron as a comfort rather than a burden, a reminder that he was a man who belonged to no one but the wind and the trail and the lead, and that was the only way he ever wanted it to be. The story of the collected debt would be told in the saloons for a generation, but the name of the man who saved the valley would remain a secret, hidden in the dust of the road. I will see you in the next valley where the truths are hidden in the canyons and the legends are written in the sand of the high plains. Goodbye for now, and keep your eyes on the horizon, because you never know what the next ridge will reveal. In this wild and wicked world of the Old West, the gunslinger rode until the heat of the day started to shimmer off the alkali flats, and he found a small spring hidden in a cluster of cottonwoods where the water was cold and the shade was deep. He washed the grit of Red Ridge from his face and looked at his reflection in the pool. Seeing the face of a man who had seen too many lives sold for a moment of paper wealth, he knew that Aldrich's kind would be back with more men and more paper. But he also knew that once the people hold the truth in their hands, they do not let it go without a fight. He thought about the way Elena had looked at him as he rode away, and he realized that the greatest collection of all is the collection of a person escort's dignity from the hands of those who thought they could own it. He saddled Scout and mounted up, feeling the strength of the animal beneath him, a partner that did not care about debts or railroad shares. And he turned his head toward the border, knowing that the journey was never really finished as long as there was one more lie to uncover and one more truth to speak. In the language of the gun, the road was winding and the rocks were sharp. But for the first time in a month, the gunslinger felt like he was riding toward a future that was not defined by the shadows of the past. He had collected the debt, and by doing so, he had made himself a target for every corrupt man in the territory. But that was a price he was willing to pay to ensure that the homesteaders of the high plains were not erased from the history of the country. Thank you for being a part of this chronicle and for helping to keep the spirit of these stories alive in a world that often forgets the lessons of the trail. Keep your powder dry and your horse ready, because the frontier never sleeps, and the next story is always just around the bend of the road. Adios for now, and I will see you when the dust settles on the next road. We travel together, searching for the truths that make the West what it was. Adios.